Hi, thank you for joining us today for our Remember, Reflect, Recommit Celebrating Women's Suffrage virtual conference. I'm Shireen Guru, an undergraduate senior in the History Department here at Hopkins. I have spent the past few years in a wide array of courses studying women and the history of how women engage in the political sphere, both from inside the home and outside of it. In the past year, I've worked closely with Dr. Martha Jones on the Berkshire Conference and am now a Hugh Hopkins Fellow in the Sheridan Libraries, working on the history of women at Hopkins. While the era and geographic location often vary, I have dedicated my undergraduate time to the study of women. On behalf of the SNF Agora Institute, I'm excited to be introducing this afternoon's panel, Women Working Across the Atlantic. SNF Agora is a relatively new institute at Johns Hopkins that examines the challenges of democracy and identifies actionable solutions. They are hosting this conference to recognize the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and to bring researchers and practitioners together with the Johns Hopkins community and the general public for a discussion about the history of women fighting for civil rights, including the right to vote, to show how crucial women's participation is to a thriving democracy, and to inspire future civic engagement. With us today, we have Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, a 30-year diplomat and the longest-serving U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Malta. Admiral Michelle Howard, a retired admiral of the U.S. Navy and the first African-American woman to reach the rank of 3 stars and 4 stars in the armed forces. Dr. Tamara Wittes, senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, and Professor Mary Cerati, Marie Jose and Henry R. Kravis Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. They will spend about 35 minutes sharing their experiences working to ensure U.S. safety and to foster democracy around the world, the specific role they have played in protecting and promoting women's rights internationally, and why it's so important to include women in our country's efforts abroad. Then moderator Professor Cerati will open the discussion up for your questions. Anytime throughout this conversation, you can submit your question through the dialog box, which is right next to the video, or just below, depending on your device. Thank you all for being here. I'll turn the conversation over to Professor Cerati and see you all at the other end of the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shireen. Thank you all for joining us remotely for a wonderful day, looking at, on a wonderful occasion, looking at, in this panel, how women have worked across the Atlantic Ocean. As Shireen said, we've got an excellent panel with us, and I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists to just introduce themselves a little bit through their professional experiences. So we have here, for example, the Admiral could tell us perhaps a little bit about her career, in particular, your time in NATO command. That's a subject of interest to me because I'm working on the history of NATO. We have Ambassador Winstanley, and I've asked her if she'd be willing to talk about how she won an award for courage during an attack on the U.S. Consulate General in Jeddah. I'd also asked her, as a SAIS Hopkins alum, to talk about how that degree has helped her career and perhaps a little bit about her work for Senator Biden. And finally, we have Tamara Wittes. I'd like to ask her to talk a little bit about her time at the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau of the State Department, particularly during the Arab Spring. So perhaps we could start with you, Admiral.
Thank you, Professor. My career actually is perfect for this panel because my career was able to exist because of changes in the law. So literally, coming out of World War II, there was a combat exclusion law policy where women couldn't serve on combatant ships or fly in combat aircraft, and women were not allowed to be admirals. The law allowing women to be admirals was not repealed to '67. And so when I started the Navy in '82, women were just being allowed to go on to support ships. And then the combat exclusion law was repealed after Desert Storm, which meant combatant ships were opened up to women. By that point, I was a lieutenant commander, had been in about 13 years, and I was able to move into the amphibious forces. But like most organizations, if you can't serve in the main mission of the organization, and I mean if it's corporate America and its operations or sales, you don't have the opportunity to get the experience sets to grow up to be a leader in that organization, whether it's admiral or senior vice president. So the law changing and allowing women to serve, have the same opportunities as men, was essential to my career. And then I had command of a ship, command of a task force, and I culminated with command as a 4-star of Naval Forces Europe and Africa, a U.S. command, and at the same time I had command of Joint Allied Force South, which is the NATO operational NATO command of 4-star command. So between those two, as a 4-star, I had on the U.S. side oversight of combat operations. We were doing strikes into Libya at the request of the transnational government because of ISIS. We were doing strikes into Syria. We were looking at 2 carriers at one point in the Eastern Med. I was working for 2 combatant commanders, had a range of missions from ballistic missile defense and a theater that went from the North Arctic all the way down to South Africa and the waters. And so, you know, on a low day, about 50,000 people, assets like submarines and aircraft carriers. And then on a big day, the number of people underneath my command and control could almost double. But for NATO, a number of ongoing missions still in support, they were still in support of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. Directly under me we were doing a training mission in Iraq, and then an ongoing mission in peacekeeping in Kosovo. And for me, for someone who had been an advocate of women, peace, and security, having oversight of this mission, understanding all the different nations that are involved. So it was NATO framework, but it's a UN mission. So there's members from around the world, countries from around the world who contribute to that mission. Then the participation of women in that mission, still today, it's not a combat zone anymore, but it's still tense. I mean, my first week on the job, people fired RPGs at the cabinet while it was in session, so the parliament had to evacuate.
Perhaps for the audience, explain RPG, since for the civilian audience.
Propelled grenades. Did some damage to the building, didn't hurt people, but you know, there's an envoy for trying to get to normal diplomatic relations between Serbia and Kosovo. Assassination attempt on her. They blew up the hotel. I had Hungarian troops in different areas throughout Kosovo. They were attacked with grenades. And so still tense, not quite combat. But what we found across the different countries, you'd have these wonderful women soldiers who it turns out are essential for the women of the country to be able to communicate issues, communicate information to the NATO and plus member nations that are trying to maintain the peace. And I found during the time I was involved that there's times the women on the citizens of Kosovo who happen to be women, they could not communicate directly to their government, but they could communicate to NATO and then NATO could go to the government and start to get to solutions. Simple things like, you know, the local women's shelters are overcrowded or they're running out of free food or clothing. And then one of my proudest moments is in 2017, we sponsored a Women's Day, International Women's Day, outside of the compounds in the capital of Kosovo. And because NATO sponsored, and we had the ambassadors from different nations, ambassadors to Kosovo from different nations who had contributing troops there, then the politicals came from Kosovo. More to, I think, be seen by the different nations, but we provided these forums where the women could talk about what their lives were like. And for once, the politicians were getting direct feedback from the women of the country. Everything from the educational system didn't have parity. The history books were written in a way that literally prejudiced and biased against women and reinforcing cultural norms that do not allow for full citizenship. So just a whole slew of actions that the political leadership needed to look into. So that opportunity at NATO women, peace, and security, I think of as the capstone of my career. And thank you for inviting me to participate today and talk more about women in security, women, peace, and security, and then women working across the Atlantic.
That was so fascinating. I say we extend the panel to 4 or 5 hours and just keep going. So I'm sure you're all okay with that. But if I could just briefly ask one follow-up question, given, as you said, there were, at the time that you were starting your career, so many obstacles to women in the Navy, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about why you still chose the Navy despite that. Was it partly because of the challenge, or was there family history? I'd be interested to know why the Navy in the first place.
So after my first 2 ships, a support ship, maintenance support ship, and then the training carrier, which could not deploy because we weren't allowed to deploy on ships at that point, I thought about leaving. And then I was a lieutenant, junior lieutenant. I actually went out and sought people of color who worked in engineering careers. I met a woman from Kodak. A man who worked for an architect firm. It was fascinating to me. By the time we finished having lunch or dinner, they're all saying, you should stay in. You have better opportunities in the military. The one thing that got me from the women I talked to is they go, you know what? You get paid the same. And these women were high-powered engineers, and they knew they were not, the scale difference in what they were getting paid for their work was significant. And we're talking the 80s. And I think women were making something like, 48 cents on the dollar during that time frame for across different occupations. And then in reality, the sailors and Marines and the missions you get, I just knew I was not going to be happy being a librarian. So
some of my best friends are librarians, speaking as a historian. But that's true. Everybody has to find their calling. So you had found yours. So
we do. But I was surprised to learn that folks who hadn't served in the military thought, as a woman of color, I had much more opportunity in the military than they did in their corporate firms.
Actually, I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I can't hesitate to jump in. I have a good friend, an Air Force Academy graduate, colonel in the U.S. Air Force, a woman. And she was involved in a comparative study of women in leadership roles. And she actually did a survey of universities to look as a comparative study. And she was amazed to discover actually how few women there were in top ranks at the university. And she was encountering the same response you are, which is, the military actually in many ways is ahead of the academic environment, which is sort of counterintuitive because you often think of campuses as really being at the forefront. And this event actually caused me to look up some statistics about women in the academic world, which to me as a tenured female professor was shocking. There's actually a Brookings report that just came out last year showing that the number of women at my rank, tenured professors, is only 27% in the entire United States and falling, despite the fact that the number of women earning advanced degrees has tripled in the same time period it looked at in the study. And to be brutally honest, I then looked at my own institution, SICE, and the academic board that I'm on, that's the highest body, and I'm at the highest rank. There's 33 members and only 3 of us are women. So that means, our representation is in the single digits. And it was a real eye-opener for me interacting with my friend, this U.S. Air Force colonel, and realizing actually my institution is the one that's farther behind in these issues. And occasionally, I even personally experience the consequences of this when I show up in an event to speak. This didn't used to happen when I was younger because there are plenty of female students and grad students and postdocs. But at my level, only 10% of us or less are women. When I show up at conferences where I'm a speaker, this has started happening more and more frequently. I'm sometimes just handed receipts or handed a USB stick and said, can you print my talk out? Or I get yelled at because the slides aren't displaying properly, because there's just an assumption that I must be there to be the administrative assistant, because that's a woman my age would not be there otherwise. And that, amazes me. And I wouldn't usually comment on it, but because this is an event about women in the professional world, I now realize, given that there's a 90% chance I'm not a professor, that's the reason you have this, unconscious bias. And so when I talked to my friend in the military, she said, well, we are wearing our rank on our shoulders, right? So, that doesn't happen in the academic world. So apologize, audience, for long-winded introduction, but I just wanted to second very strongly what the Admiral has said. So Ambassador, perhaps you could talk a little bit about your career.
Thank you. I also want to second the important points that the Admiral made about women, peace, and security, the importance about women being at the table with regard to conflict resolution, because women and their families are often on the front lines, and we all know that negotiations go more smoothly, are more effective, agreements last longer if you have those that are directly impacted contributing to the scope of the solutions that are being reached. So that was absolutely, I'm a huge supporter of that. I love that there is legislation here in the United States, and we need to do more, put more clothing on those bones. And hopefully the next administration will be doing just that. I joined the diplomatic corps out of Ohio, middle class. Nobody had traveled overseas except with the military. I'm the only one in my family I have 3 siblings. I'm the only one who hasn't been in the military. But I had the good sense to realize that would not have suited my personality. So I need a bit more flexibility and a bit more gray in the decision-making and how they're arrived at. Middle East, because I did a sophomore year abroad at Tel Aviv University and got very interested in Arab-Israeli conflict, which I know that Tammy can speak a great deal on as well, and proceeded on from there. There were very few people who looked like me. Perhaps again, as Admiral, for me, that was a challenge. If you're not expecting me or don't think I should be there, my response is, get out of my way, I'm coming. So I found the challenges exciting and things to be overcome. You don't overcome it with a lot of help, however. And so I've had great mentors and colleagues, and I'd say particularly friends and family. I don't know about the military, but certainly in the diplomatic corps, it's important to remember that you are competing with just about everybody around you who's in the room. And so recognizing those friendships do have some limits. You asked me specifically, Professor, to talk about Jeddah. It was an assignment where it was my first opportunity to be the chief of mission of a diplomatic mission. I was the first woman to be so in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis had mixed feelings, shall I say, because I'm a diplomat, so we'll say that. And of course, while I was generally very successful, you make mistakes. You make mistakes, and the balance I was trying to achieve was being American, conducting myself as an American woman and certainly as an American diplomat, but also being respectful and cognizant of local culture and local mores. And so not trying to put anything in anyone's face with regard to how I dressed or conduct myself, but of course, getting the work done and being true to who I am and the nation that I respected. So we knew that there were threats against the mission, against Americans in general. Americans had been killed in the preceding year that I had been in Saudi Arabia. We knew that our consulate was being watched, but our security steps, and we had many, I assure you, including, not allowing people to drive, barbed wire around the mission, guards inside the wall, and many things I can't even tell you about, to try and keep everyone safe who was on the compound, whether they were Americans or whether they were Saudis coming in for business. Anytime you are chief of mission, your first responsibility is to your people, to their safety and security. And every principal officer, every deputy chief of mission, every ambassador, you wake up thinking about how can I keep these people safe? And you go to sleep thinking, how can I keep these people safe? And it is unfortunately a fact of life that many diplomats, and certainly at my level, probably it's been a while since in the military, people have been specifically shot at my level, or people trying to kill you. It isn't something that often happens either way, but it does happen certainly in the diplomatic corps. We've lost ambassadors before and others. So it was a testament to our ability to put in place what we had prepared for, planned for, in case of attack. Unfortunately, heartbreakingly, 5 of our colleagues were lost that day, 10 were wounded. It wasn't enough, but pulling together, trying to get assistance to everyone who was on the compound, and people were in different places, and being in contact with, trying to keep people calm and assured that help was on the way was really what took a lot of attention during that time. I will say it was certainly, obviously, one of the worst experiences of my life, but a learning experience, a leadership experience, and 2 other things. One, personally, I certainly became a much better ambassador as a result of this experience. And I say that because at the time I thought, in the aftermath of supporting the people who had, the families of the people who had lost their lives or had been wounded, the physical injuries were very much in my mind. And I did not take as much cognizance of the emotional and the mental injuries that other people had taken. And so I thought I was doing the necessary to reach out to make people feel supported and touched, etc. But I will say that I put my emphasis on those who had those physical injuries and did not put as much emphasis as was needed on those who were emotionally or mentally damaged. I will say that. It was a lesson hard learned. And the other lesson I learned, because as a result of that incident, I lost my first ambassadorship. And I will say, I know I did everything possible to protect the people under my watch, under my responsibility. And I had a boss tell me that while what happened was not my fault, that sometimes the institution is more important than the individual. And this is something that women learn often. If you recall Barbara Bush talking about the general who was in charge of the prison when Abu Ghraib came out. And I think Barbara Bush said, it's the girl who usually takes the hit on this. So that was a hard lesson for me to learn at the time. Again, it's one that has stood me in excellent stead as I've continued to grow and prosper, and one that I share freely, because it is a fact, regardless of your gender, your race, your sexual orientation, your background, at some point, you are going to get screwed. You are going to make a mistake. And it isn't what happens to you, it's what do you do with it? How do you retrieve yourself? How do you pull yourself up and continue? I'll stop there.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but yes, that I have to say, for all the younger women out there, it's not getting knocked down, it's standing back up. So if something happens, you get knocked down, you stand back up. So thank you very much. That was really two very moving opening. I sense everyone agrees we should extend this to 6 or 7 hours at this point. So now we still have more to come. We have Dr. Wittes, who, as I said, was in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau during the Arab Spring. So if you could tell us a little bit about perhaps your career and background, and then particularly talk about that incident, that time period, we'd be really grateful.
Sure, Professor Cerati. First, let me just say what a treat it is to share this event with you and with these 2 incredible women for whom I have such admiration. And Gina just gave an example of the grace and principle and determination that makes me admire her so much and be so grateful to work with her. I, like you, come from an academic background. And have spent most of my career in think tanks outside government, but partnering with folks in government, trying to provide solutions to folks in government. And then ultimately as a political appointee going into government during the Biden administration. Freudian slip during the Obama administration. And that was at that point, the culmination of a career that I felt was in many ways preparing me to take on a role that was a senior role as a deputy assistant secretary in the regional bureau. It was a role also, coming in from the outside on behalf of the president, trying to implement his agenda within the Department of State. And it ended up being a period of challenge far beyond what we anticipated, although I came in with a mandate to work on behalf of civil society engagement and democracy and human rights in the Middle East. That was my charge, and I ran an assistance program in the Bureau that worked across the region in the Arab world and in Israel, let me clarify, not in Iran, to support civil society, to support indigenous demands for political and economic and social change. But the work that we were trying to do to support the demands of those in the region for more transparent, accountable, responsive government and for more participation and more dignity, all that work was insufficient to prepare us when history landed on our doorstep, as it did in December 2010 with the outbreak of the uprising in Tunisia. And so within 6 or 8 weeks, we had uprisings in a half dozen countries. We evacuated, I think, 5 embassies. Gina can correct me. Simultaneously, either evacuated or ordered departure, which meant that family members and non-essential personnel left. So we had both a policy crisis and a management crisis. And then that can very quickly become a leadership crisis if your leaders cannot keep up with the pace of events and give people a direction to go. Now, the decisions at that point were, for the most part, well above my pay grade, and I can be grateful for that. But I had to do my best to advise and give my best recommendations in very heated debates sometimes in the policy process, because a number of these countries were countries where we have a complex mix of interests. And so there was not unanimity on what direction to go. I also saw my colleagues in the Foreign Service, in the State Department, in the Pentagon, who had relationships in Egypt, for example, that went back decades, lose the partner that the United States had relied on to do business with over 30 years, Hosni Mubarak. And I saw not just the policy challenge, but the psychological challenge of that in these institutions. And I was really struck by the ways in which these policy institutions, and all of you at SAIS who are studying, foreign policy, know this intellectually, but to see upfront that, this isn't just about weighing costs and benefits and making judgments with incomplete information under time pressure. This is also a bunch of human beings confronting challenge, crisis, and change. And the psychology of that moment, I think, was in many ways as challenging as the sort of substance. I think that there are a few things that I take away from that. One is, and Gina was just emphasizing this, how important it is in a moment of challenge as a leader, not just to give directions, strategic direction and guidance and walk people through what needs to happen, but how to lead with empathy, how to lead your people with a sense of what they're going through and buoy them through the process. And I was very fortunate to work for an incredible leader in Jeff Feltman, who was the Assistant Secretary of Near East Affairs, who I think did that very well. The other thing I learned is that even though government is full of rules and procedures, and you need to be very careful not to violate those, because policy has to be neutral with respect to American citizens, with respect to the market, the way we bid contracts or give grants. We have to be fair. And And that's one of the things I find most distressing now, is how far our current political leadership is from understanding and respecting that. But I also learned that when you need to do big things, you can find ways, even within those rules and constraints, to do big things. And I'm proud of a couple big things we did. We actually took my program, which had $60 or $75 million budget at that point, I think, throughout our budget planning for the fiscal year, and reworked all of our programs in order to find money that no other program in the U.S. government could find to support Tunisia in its democratic transition. I think that's probably the most impactful thing I did during my time there. And I didn't do it alone. I did it because my team was willing to be creative and figure out how to push the rules. I think the final thing I took away from my time in government and really brought back to the work I do now at Brookings and with some of the other organizations I'm involved with, like the Leadership Council for Women in National Security, which Gina and Admiral Howard are both involved with as well, is that government was actually the most diverse environment in which I had worked in my career up until that point. And that blew me away. It blew me away. And I'll be perfectly honest, I had spent the first half of my career in international relations trying really hard not to be a woman in international relations, just trying to do international relations. And I came out of my experience in government with an understanding of how much diversity enriches the work that we do, and also how unavoidable it is to confront issues of exclusion and injustice in our work, and how imperative it is for me at this stage in my career to be someone who helps push the envelope and make it better for the people who are coming behind me. And Admiral Howard, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first time we met was actually at an event for women in international security. It was probably in the 90s or the early 2000s, but I remember meeting you because WISE was so important to me when I was just coming up in the field. It was a place where I could see women who were ahead of me and doing what I wanted to do and achieving and giving me heart and inspiring me. And so I think that that's a big part of how I think about the work I do now.
Yeah, the Women in International Security was a wonderful organization. Admiral, did you want to say something about the organization?
No, I just, I think we'll get to it in the next question. It's, so in the night, when I came out of command and then got to the Beltway for the first time, and I found myself being, I had my full-time job, and then I had the representational duty, tasked to be a spokesperson for the Navy as the equal opportunity, as the combat exclusion law was repealed. And so I found myself in many different forms, either, just as a participant or just as an observer. But it also exposed me to the breadth of women across the different agencies in the federal government. And, and that was in many ways empowering, because you're just like, wow, you have your challenges, but I knew you just intuitively knew whether women were at State Department or, Treasury, or that they were dealing with a lot of similar issues. But the point is, they're there. And as compared to even now, when I go to different organizations, tech organizations, for example, and the percentage of women is very small, and the organizations are not as diverse as we would like them to be.
I understand we were talking to the panelists before the event began that the Leadership Council is actively trying to do something today to promote women in the field. So perhaps either Admiral or Dr. Wittes, perhaps you'd like to talk about what happened today.
when we started the Leadership Council, which was almost a year and a half ago now, we launched, we began by asking all the presidential candidates, and at that point there were almost 24, to sign a pledge that if they won, they would seek gender parity in their national security appointments. And we got 18 candidates to sign that pledge, including Vice President Biden. And then we thought, okay, how can we hold them to account on this? And you know, anyone who works in our field knows and has probably heard 1,000 times, well, there just aren't enough women, you know, in nuclear security, or there just aren't enough women doing counterterrorism, you know. And we knew that wasn't true because, as Admiral Howard said, they're there. So we launched an initiative to recruit, and we asked peers and senior leaders to nominate women that were qualified to serve in Senate-confirmed roles in national security and foreign policy in the next administration. So this week, we transmitted to the Biden and Trump campaigns databases, because women could choose whether they're willing to serve in one or the other, or potentially either one. Databases containing the names and backgrounds of 850 plus women. They are well outside the Beltway network. They come from local government, they come from industry, they come from academia, they have management expertise, they have issue expertise, and they are senior leaders ready to serve. And so no more excuses. That's what we did this week.
Excellent. Well, I see we're starting to get questions sent in from our virtual audience. So we have, I think, about 11 minutes to go. So let me start taking some questions, and we'll see how far we can get. One of the questions is, what steps can be taken to interest and encourage women to go into your fields? In particular, what advice would you give young women today who want to go either into the foreign service or military service? I don't know who wants to jump. We have, you know, I don't know who wants to jump into that. Ambassador?
The first thing I would say to anyone interested in either is, you are needed. You are needed. We need your voice. We need your presence. We need your perspective. Nobody can say that we have gotten our national security right yet. And I think with a wider array of perspectives and voices and backgrounds, that we can do a better job. So the first thing is, know there is space waiting for you there. And whatever travails that you're seeing now with regard to our diplomatic corps at the least, and to some extent our military as well, I would say that this too shall pass. So you're needed. Colleagues, what else?
Admiral, Dr. Wittes?
So from a military perspective, I really started to get involved in that same question when I was vice chief. And so from the time I started the Navy, when women were 5% of the Navy, to the time I retired, women were 20% of the Navy. There were a couple of things, though, we had to take into account. One, we're an all-volunteer force. And the propensity, the desire for women to come and be a sailor or soldier is not as high as it is for a male. It's just like, do you want to be a police officer or do you want to be a diplomat? And most women would probably say diplomat over police officer. So we had to tackle that. But one of the things we found is, as the percentage of women increased and we had more success stories where it was a woman master diver, or the first woman commanding officer of a ship, then the idea that this is possible and compatible with being a mother and having a career, the women who are willing to serve started to increase. In my last 5 years as vice chief, the percentage of women applying and going to Annapolis got to the point where one of the last classes to be enrolled was 30% women, which is pretty significant. And the percentage of women at Annapolis across the 4 classes well outstripped both the Air Force Academy and West Point. So I was pretty proud about that.
Little service rivalry there.
But the last thing was, we're also not a volunteer force, but an all recruited force. And I had us look at how we recruit. And it's interesting, culturally, how you recruit people, just like how you advertise a company that you have job openings, makes a difference in the appeal to the candidates. Well, one of the it was just happened. It turned out, despite the fact the Navy was running 22% women at the time, our recruiting force was less than 10% women. So I said, we need to change our recruiting force to match what the Navy looks like. And then when a candidate walks in and she happens to be a woman and she sees a woman there, it's different than walking into a recruiting office when it's all men. And so literally within a few years of changing how we recruited, thinking about the potential of women candidates, we were starting to bring in 25% women a year out of those who went to boot camp. So sometimes it's just how you look to the outside world. And if State Department website has leadership and it's all male, then it might not appeal as much as another federal agency where you see success.
Dr. Wittes, did you want to jump in?
No, I think those are both fantastic. I guess the one piece of advice I would have is, along the lines of what Gina was saying, that you are needed. I would say, don't be deterred. And what Admiral Howard said is right. If you can't see it, it's hard to imagine that you can be it, right? And so the representation really does matter. The recruiting really does matter. But at the end of the day, if you are passionate, then you should charge ahead, even if you are the only or one of the only. I think all three of us probably spent many years being the only in the room, in various rooms. And you shouldn't let that intimidate you, because somebody has to be first. We just want to make sure that it isn't, that it's not first and only, or it's not, one at a time.
No, absolutely. As I was saying before, I'm still amazed in an academic setting. I'm still amazed that I'm regularly the only woman in a room in 2020, which seems to me to be, frankly, kind of amazing, actually. When I actually when I was in graduate school and starting to teach myself, I belatedly realized I had not had a single female professor. And so I didn't actually have a role model for how to lecture as a female professor. And I just sort of, had to develop my own. So it is, as the Admiral was saying, it's really helpful if you've seen someone do that before, you realize, oh, okay, there's less deep snow to plow it by yourself if you've seen someone forge a path. So absolutely, to just reinforce what everyone's saying, you are definitely needed. We have lots of questions, unfortunately not very much time. We have about 8 minutes left. I think I'll go to a question that came in related to the pandemic, actually. So someone identified as SR has put the following into the question box. Commentators have noted higher success in pandemic response by countries led by women. What's your perspective, based on your professional experience, on why this may be the case?
Okay. I'm going to wait for someone else so I don't say anything not politically correct. Well, they're women.
All right. Well, I'll be a social scientist for a second. And I'll say, yes, there is a correlation. But does that mean that you can assign causation? Right? I think actually that when there has been some good work done on this over the last few months, when we dig into the data a little bit more, what we see is that the fact that these countries are led by women is an indicator of other things about these societies. That these are societies who are electing women to leadership tells us other things about these societies. And one of the things it tells us is that these societies, on average, comparatively, invest more in social welfare, they invest more in healthcare, and they have higher levels of social trust. And so they have the infrastructure to combat pandemics. And when their female leaders tell them what they need to do to combat the pandemic, they trust their leaders, and they comply. So I think, that's the explanation, which isn't to say that female leadership is irrelevant. I think what it really tells us is that societies with a more inclusive culture are more supportive of the ingredients of resilience. And they are also more supportive of female leadership.
That's a good answer.
Ambassador, did you want to build on that?
No, that was a good answer, a right answer, and yes.
Excellent.
And the women.
Admiral, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add one personal experience when there was the Ebola crisis, and eventually the Department of Defense was asked to provide support overseas, to both the CDC and other agencies, just because we have a capability of movement and logistics. Before we got to that point, and I was a vice chief, all the other vice chiefs were male. And we were starting to, with our surgeon generals, wrap our heads around this months before I started to talk about the potential impact on our sailors. How many sailors do we know? Because not all soldiers and sailors are U.S. citizens. How many did we have from the countries? What were we going to tell them? Obviously, if the holidays were coming up, they would want to go home, and that might not be. We needed policy with the internal. And so I started to do deep dives, data diving, and then, and to me, it was about the people, our people. And I started to talk to my fellow vice chiefs, and they're like, this is not our problem. And then my chief, God bless him, the CNO said, Michelle, you're on the right track. You just keep pushing. Well, I found out within the Navy, we had several thousand sailors who were not U.S. citizens. They're U.S. sailors, but they were from West Africa. And then when I thought about it more, we had several other military members from other countries from West Africa in our schools in the United States who were probably going to go back and then try and get back to the United States. And so then once it started to look like there could be a causal connection there between people traveling and bringing the disease back to the United States, whether they were enrolled in our schools from Africa or from Africa and part of our military, then everybody got interested. But I found it fascinating that the people orientation came from the only woman of the four stars, and that it took a sort of just going to have mission impact perspective to get my fellow vice chiefs to think about it.
Thank you so much. I see we're at the time that I was given by the organizers, but I also see more questions coming in. Okay, I see Shireen coming back to corral us.
So thank you to our audience for watching and for sending in all of their great questions. Just remember, tomorrow, as part of the Remember, Reflect, Recommit conference, SNF Agora is offering 2 hands-on training, one on personal storytelling geared to support women to become protagonists in their own life stories, and another focusing on ensuring women's rights and abilities to participate in electoral politics. These are both free hands-on workshops that are open to the public. Space is available, but registration is required. Visit snfagora.jhu.edu for more information. And thank you all again for joining us.